So up until now, we've been talking about GDP, the gross domestic product, or the output of a country. Now we want to take a step back and sort of focus on the inputs of this domestic product. How do we reach this point? What goes into producing this gross domestic product? And we'll start off by looking at the factors of production. And the factors of production can be broken down into three main categories. The first being labor. And the US is actually a labor intensive economy. In fact, over 70% of of the cost of production within the US falls under labor. And the second category is K, also known as capital or capital stock. And that's anything from machines to to any piece of equipment used by the laborers to manufacture products. And finally, the third piece is basically all encompassing anything aside from capital and labor. And the reason why we use capital and labor is to keep our equation simple. So the other category would include things like energy and resources, land, and any other pieces like that that didn't get counted in labor and capital. Now, when we want to figure out how we get GDP, what we've been able to do is come up with a function that describes the inputs, the inputs and how they come together in order to produce GDP. And that's known as the Cobb-Douglas production function. And the function looks like this: Y, or GDP, is equal to A, which is productivity, times K, which is capital, to the alpha, which represents the intensity or how much capital is actually being used in the production, times N, which stands for labor, times 1 minus alpha, which stands for the intensity of labor, or how much labor is being used in the production of this certain product or this GDP. Now, A, productivity, represents specifically the relative measure of output obtainable for a given amount of inputs. So given these are your inputs, productivity is a factor that multiplies by the amount of your inputs to tell you how much you can get out of those inputs. And when you combine all this together, this production function is also known as technology, or your ability to combine inputs in order to pull out outputs, in order to produce products or GDP. Now, we're going to move on to actually understanding what capital K and labor N actually mean in this function. So when we say K is to the alpha, it's raised to the alpha power. What we're saying is what we're essentially saying is this is how much K we're using. This is how intense K is in the equation. And in the US, that's about 30% or 0.3. So K is to the 0.3, and N, the labor, is to the 0.7. Like we said before, the U.S. is a labor intensive economy. Now, both K and N, if you're looking at the function, labor and capital are positive functions, but with decreasing returns. Meaning that as you add, for every added worker, for example, in labor, for every added hour of work, your product, what you get from that extra hour, the amount of product you get from that hour is diminishing, is decreasing. So you're increasing at a decreasing rate. So you're positive at a decreasing rate. So you have diminishing marginal returns. Now, because the exponent alpha is 0.3, and so for capital it's smaller, we see diminishing marginal returns at a worse rate than that of labor. So for every extra unit of labor versus every extra unit of capital, we see labor is going to give us greater returns than are going to be capital. Meaning the labor function is more steep. It's steeper, meaning for every unit of labor added, we get a larger amount of product in the final production. Now, productivity, A, represents, again, how you combine these two factors. It's how you combine these two inputs. So it's literally a factor that you multiply them by. So supply shocks, which is a negative piece or push of productivity would literally scale down the production line or the production function because it's a negative shock. So what ends up happening is you'll never come back, or you'll never reach the point that you would have reached, or the amount of marginal product or the amount of product that you would have reached had you not had that supply shock. So the curve ends up running like this, and this top curve, which was your original, will never hit this bottom curve. This bottom curve will never hit the top because of that supply shock. Now, when we also try to analyze from this function, like we said, the marginal products, or how much you get for how much you give, for how much you put in. And as we stated, the alpha represents that of capital, and the 1 minus alpha represents that of labor. Now we try to keep in mind this idea of productivity and costs whenever we look at the economy and markets. For example, for stock, if we're looking at the financial markets, productivity is a very important factor. Productivity and costs. With increased productivity and low costs, it's very good for stocks, and it's very good for bonds because it means that companies are able to produce goods at more competitive prices and not face serious losses. Now, when we see high costs or a high cost index or a time of inflation, companies have a harder time producing at an above ground rate, meaning at a rate where they're not facing losses. And therefore, that's a tough time. When we have those high costs, we first think about inflation, right? High cost means inflation. So bonds are very exposed to inflation risk. So we know bonds are in trouble whenever costs are high. But now, we would also quickly come to assume that stocks are also in trouble because companies are having trouble producing. It's hard for them to produce. Or in general, just inflation is bad for the market. It causes uncertainty, or it's the result of uncertainty. But we still say that stocks could act as a good hedge towards the risk of inflation exposure to your bonds because of the dividends that they could pay out in the future, which could cancel out the inflationary exposure to your bonds. Finally, we're going to talk about actual productivity, productivity in terms of labor. Now, we can figure out very easily how much output we get per hour. That's called labor productivity. Is how much you get per hour of labor. So if you put in, let's say, so what you'll essentially do is, let's say our GDP is a certain number, and our N, or our labor, is a certain number. Divide GDP by N, and you get your labor productivity, your output per hour. But what's really important when comparing countries or nations is our output per dollar. And we can figure that because we care about how much it costs us. If an hour costs us $10 here and $50 in another country, I'd rather spend my money here. But how productive are they within that hour based on my dollar? So that other country was 1/5 as productive as they are over here. So in order to determine that, we use unit labor cost, which is wage times your hours worked. So the total amount of money, the total expenditure on labor, divided by your GDP, divided by how much output goes out. So it's your cost per unit of output. And that's the best way to actually measure between nations which one is more productive and or not. So finally, when again looking at a productivity and cost report, it's important to remember the effects that it could have on the market, which could be relatively extreme if analyst targets aren't met. And talking about productivity and output, we also want to think about the difference between the short run and the long run. In the short run, or the short term, capital is relatively fixed. It's very hard to change capital stock, to change machinery and equipment within a factory. Whereas labor, it's very simple. It's very easy to change. We could hire someone and fire someone else in a very quick motion relative to capital. And therefore, changes in production or changes in GDP growth or declines in GDP over the short run tend to be attributed to changes in labor or increased productivity. or total factor productivity. Again, that A coefficient at the front of the equation. In the long run, capital stock doesn't increase, and an increase in capital stock ends up leading to an increase in productivity. So again, we say capital stock increases, but at a diminishing rate. So again, total factor productivity, especially in the long run, is the main source of long run growth, because in the long run, both labor and capital will see extremely diminishing marginal returns. And that's everything you need to know about productivity and cost reports.